Hi there, everyone. I'm Devin Fitzgerald, the curator of rare books and the history of printing at UCLA Library Special Collections. And today my talk is going to be on the subject of Chinese printing in early California. In these two images here, we can see something of the perspective on Chinese reading habits in early California. On the left, we have a group of men sitting reading newspapers published in modern presses. And on the right, we have groups of people reading advertisements, uh, seeking laborers and other forms of workers. Now, between these extremes of news consumption and casual advertising, there's actually a missing piece. To date, there have been no studies or attempts to reconstruct how early Chinese immigrants in California read and printed books. The absence of a history of books for the Chinese in California is actually quite surprising, because as we all know, the Chinese in fact invented printing. Sometime in the 7th century, Chinese printing began with woodblocks. By the 12th and 13th century, movable type had already been invented, but it was by no means common. The fact that movable type wasn't commonly employed for printing Chinese made for some major problems in the 19th century. As Europeans in Southeast Asia attempted to print materials for the Chinese reading public, particularly translations of the Bible and missionary tracts, Chinese woodblocks, like this woodblock here from the late 18th century, were initially employed. But after frustration with how difficult it was to recruit carvers, Europeans suddenly decided that Chinese printing practices were not suitable for modern societies. There were no easy answers for how to best print Chinese in the 19th century. However, one early success in Batavia by William Medhurst with stone lithography established a new model. Throughout Southeast Asia and South China, lithography was gradually adapted. The use of lithography for printing Chinese in Southeast Asia and East Asia was known in early California, and already by 1854, we see early printing in Chinese on the West Coast. Hudson and Howard, a printing firm owned in part by the Presbyterian William D.M. Howard, chose to print a portion of Golden Hills News in Chinese in lithography. It was a joint venture owned by American printers and an unknown Chinese author who translated and transcribed the contents of the news. The earliest first-hand account we have of Chinese lithographic printing in San Francisco is from almost 3 decades after the Golden Hills News was printed. In 1883, in a census office report on newspaper and periodical printing, a press known as the Hua Qi Press was described in detail. The press was owned by Ye Zhen, and the census described Ye as someone who printed through a process of primitive lithography, wherein Chinese characters were written on a sheet of paper in a peculiar ink. The prepared papers were then pressed onto stones to transfer the ink, and the stones were then ready to be used for lithographic printing. When printing was done, the stone was chemically cleaned and prepared for the next sheet. Lithography remained the dominant form of printing in California until the 1890s, when the first fonts of movable Chinese type were imported from Hong Kong. Westerners viewing Chinese movable type printing were amazed at the size of the type cases. One 1890 newspaper described the printing offices in a Chinese press as follows. He said, "Chinese requires 11,000 spaces to hold a font. The large cases are arranged around the room and divided for spaces for each individual piece of type, which is a word in itself. The work has been carefully systematized, and characters are arranged according to their formation. A division is devoted to the simple character that stands for wood and all of its amplifications. In this space or column are to be found, including box, bed, plum tree, and so on." For Westerners observing Chinese printing practices, it seemed as though the language itself was anti-modern. In fact, a series of articles in the 1890s emphasized that until Chinese language was reformed, there was no hope that it could ever maintain a modern reading public. But what Americans said about Chinese printing and what was actually occurring were two different things. As I've already stated, several scholars like Mark H.M. Lai have established that there was a vibrant reading public for Chinese newspapers. But it turns out that there were also readers of books printed in America, and that these books were so popular that they were even exported back to China. But one problem in trying to study the history of the Chinese book in California is that we didn't actually know that any books were printed in California. When I began consulting bibliographies and studies of early newspaper printing, I couldn't find any references to books being printed, and any attempts to search in library holdings also proved fruitless. So I went back to the newspapers themselves, because I knew that if they were like American newspapers, they would have advertisements, and through those advertisements, I hoped I could perhaps be able to reconstruct what Chinese readers read. The 1887 edition of the Oriental, published by the Waukee Printing House, shown in the previous page, was one of the first newspapers I consulted. And I was lucky immediately, because it turned out that Waukee was a large press that printed any number of titles. Its February 12, 1887 copy of the newspaper advertised the following books: Ambassador Zheng's Record of Aids and Rewards for 35 cents, Mr. Huang's various records and poems from his journeys to Japan for 55 cents, a portrait of Liu Yongfu for 10 cents per sheets, and a concise guide to the lottery for 70 cents. So it turned out that not only were Chinese readers in San Francisco interested in books, they were interested in a wide variety of different books. When the Waukee Press switched to movable type in the 1890s, they continued issuing books. And many of these books, like this Forms for Business Letters, went into multiple editions and were in fact exported back to China. By 1900, the business of book selling in Chinese was booming in San Francisco. This list of advertisements from a 1900 newspaper shows just how many books were available to readers. Every line here has two titles, and so here we see at least 40 books that were available to readers in San Francisco by the year 1900. Using these advertisements, I was able to compile a list of potential titles that were available to readers in early California. However, I still had a problem because none of these titles could be found in any Californian or American libraries. So, to find them, I did what any reasonable Chinese book buyer would do. I went to Chinese eBay, where it turns out a large number of early San Francisco imprints that survive and no institutions that I know about were on sale for relatively inexpensive prices. Using an American book dealer, I was able to get some of these books for the collection at UCLA. Most of these books are interesting hybrid objects. If we examine this Forms for Business Letters closely, we can see what this hybridity looks like. The books are still thread-bound like a traditional Chinese book. And in fact, the paper is still printed in the exact same way, with the interior fold of the page blank. This book has been heavily used also and has been rebound in a green thread. One other interesting aspect about these books is that they all apologize for using movable type, which, as the editors note, made them prone to errors. Letter writing manuals were in fact one of the most popular genres printed in San Francisco and sent back to China. And they're actually far more interesting than you would presume, because rather than just providing blank forms for instructing people on how to write letters, they also included sample letters from Chinese diasporic communities. This Sanjiang Gam Liu So is a fascinating account of different Chinese-speaking communities in the Americas. It includes letters from Cuba, as well as letters from different Chinese communities in California. These letter writing materials provide new context for some of our most commonly surviving materials from the Chinese in early California. Letters. This letter on the left here fell out of a Chinese English phrase book in the UCLA Library Special Collection. And it's one of many letters in UCLA libraries, as well as in the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, that adhere to the norms promoted in these San Francisco imprints. Early examination of these San Francisco imprints also provides for greater context for Chinese reading habits in early California. Many of the books printed in San Francisco ended up being quite practical. They were how-to manuals and guides. And many books we find imported, such as these two texts here, were light reading. They were printed in Hong Kong and sold to an American audience at a pharmacy in Modesto, California. My early research in these texts has allowed me to begin designing a new project which will highlight the role of the Chinese book in the American West. There are 3 approaches I plan on taking in the next year. The first will be to collaborate more with Chinese American communities to help them rediscover and reappreciate the history of their ancestors' reading. The second project will be to attempt to create a bibliography of books in Chinese American hands before 1920. This will help us to rediscover who was reading what, where, and when in early America. Finally, I hope that this will allow us to begin redefining exactly what a Californian book is. At present, many major institutions on the West Coast collect in Californiana, but this is almost exclusively collecting Anglo-American publications or very early Mexican imprints. I hope that this project will help people to appreciate the importance of many of the other suppressed voices in Californian history and begin a space for new dialogues and redefining what American books are and who American readers were.